Welcome, dear listener, to The Boring Historian. Tonight, I have a story for you, one that unfolds in the quiet shadows of war. It is a tale of longing, of secrets never meant to be spoken, and of a forbidden connection between a soldier's wife and the enemy. Before we begin, make sure you've subscribed to The Boring Historian, your home for calming history, where even the darkest past is told gently, to help you drift into rest. And tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? I love knowing the little details of your world, as we step together into the past. Now, let us begin. The story begins with silence. Not the soft, comforting silence of a countryside in peace, but the heavy, watchful quiet that war leaves behind. The year was one of uncertainty, though to Anna it felt as if time had stopped altogether. Her husband, like so many others, had gone away months before, wearing the uniform of his nation, his back straight as he marched down the road with his regiment. She had stood at the edge of the village that morning, clutching his hand until the last possible moment, watching him vanish into the distance. In the weeks that followed, Anna tried to keep the rhythms of life intact. She swept the floor each morning, drew water from the well, and baked bread when the flour was not too coarse or scarce. But the house felt too large. The bed, once narrow when shared, now seemed endless and cold. She noticed details that had never mattered before. The sound of the shutters and the wind, the creak of the chair he used to sit in, the hollow quiet after she spoke aloud to herself with no one there to answer. Loneliness, she discovered, was not just an emptiness of company. It was a weight that settled into the bones, an ache that never went away. Even the seasons felt dulled. The spring flowers bloomed reluctantly, the summer heat came without joy, and in the autumn, when the leaves fell in showers of orange and gold, they seemed more like reminders of loss than signs of change. Her village was no longer her own. Occupation had changed it, reshaping familiar streets into something foreign and uneasy. Soldiers walked its cobbled lanes in boots that struck too hard against the ground. Their language carried on the wind, sharp syllables Anna could not understand but had grown used to hearing. The market square, once filled with chatter and laughter, was now subdued, with people speaking in hushed tones, their eyes glancing always at the patrols that passed by. Anna learned to keep her gaze lowered. She knew that a moment's glance could be mistaken for defiance. She kept her steps careful, her voice soft, and her face calm. Yet, despite her efforts, she sometimes felt the eyes of the enemy linger on her as she walked, as though the absence of her husband had left a shadow others could see. Nights were the hardest. She would sit at the small wooden table by candlelight, reading and rereading the last letter her husband had sent. The words had been written quickly, the ink uneven, but she had memorized every line. He spoke of long marches, of missing her cooking, of the hope that he might be home by Christmas. Christmas had long since passed, and no new letters came. The silence where his words should have been became a kind of torment, more painful than any cruel truth. In the quiet of those nights, Anna sometimes allowed herself to imagine the impossible. What if he never returned? What if the war swallowed him whole, leaving her only with fading memories and unanswered prayers? She would stop herself quickly, pushing away the thought like a dangerous fire. But the ember of fear never went out. Life continued in repetition. Mornings at the well, afternoons in the garden that no longer flourished, evenings in a house that felt too large. She exchanged brief words with neighbors, but even those conversations had thinned. Fear had stripped the village of laughter, and suspicion had silenced friendship. Each person seemed locked in their own solitude, carrying secrets that could not be shared. And then there was the stranger. Not stranger in the sense of being unknown. All the soldiers were strangers, but one among them seemed different. She noticed him not because he was loud or commanding, but because he was quiet. His eyes, when they fell on her, did not hold the cold distance of a conqueror. Instead, they lingered with something that unsettled her more deeply, a gentleness she did not expect. Anna tried to ignore it. She told herself it was only her imagination, that loneliness had made her mind play tricks. Yet she could not deny the unease that grew each time their paths crossed. A soldier who did not belong here, and a wife whose husband was far away, both bound by circumstances they could not change. It was nothing, she told herself. It had to be nothing. And yet, in that silence, in that endless absence, something unspoken had begun. The village no longer belonged to itself. Once, its streets had been alive with the sounds of barter in the marketplace, the laughter of children darting between stalls, the smell of fresh bread wafting from ovens, and the clatter of horses pulling carts. But under occupation, everything was different. Daily life continued, yes, but in a muted way. as if a great shadow lay across every home. The enemy soldiers had established their routines just as the villagers had. They marched in pairs or threes through the cobbled streets, their boots leaving dust and mud behind. The metallic jingle of their belts and rifles became as familiar as the ringing of the church bell once had been. The bell itself tolled less often now, as if afraid of calling too much attention. Anna noticed how quiet people had grown. Where once neighbors had paused to chat about the weather or the harvest, now they offered only brief nods before continuing on their way. Conversations were reduced to murmurs, half-finished sentences, eyes flicking nervously toward the patrols. It wasn't just fear of punishment that kept them silent, but the possibility that words, even innocent ones, might be overheard, twisted, and used against them. Rationing had become another constant presence. Bread was no longer plentiful, flour was coarse, meat was rare, and sugar was almost a memory. Children gnawed on hard crusts instead of soft loaves. Mothers watered down soups to stretch them further, and men bartered quietly for scraps of tobacco. Anna herself made do with what she could, though sometimes she stared at the empty shelves in her pantry and wondered how much longer she could pretend that survival was ordinary. Even the smallest acts were watched. At the well, where women gathered with buckets, soldiers lingered nearby, their rifles slung lazily across their shoulders, as though fetching water was somehow a dangerous act that needed monitoring. At the marketplace, uniformed men leaned against walls, their eyes sharp, while villagers exchanged coins with trembling hands. The act of buying a potato or a loaf of bread carried with it the tension of being observed, measured, judged. Anna had grown used to walking with her head lowered. She knew better than to let her gaze linger on the soldiers who passed, and yet she could not ignore the way their presence shaped every step she took. Even in her own garden, she felt watched. She hung laundry with careful movements, folded sheets with deliberate calm, always aware that eyes might be peering from the street. Her house itself bore the marks of occupation. A soldier had once entered, unannounced, to check for hidden radios or forbidden letters. He had rummaged through drawers, lifted her husband's coat from its peg, and glanced at her with a suspicion so sharp it cut through her silence. When he finally left, the room still felt invaded, though everything was returned to its place. After that day, Anna never fully trusted the walls of her home again. At night, the village was drowned in unnatural quiet. A curfew forced everyone indoors before dusk. The windows remained shuttered, the streets patrolled by the sound of boots echoing against the stones. Anna sometimes sat by her window, her candle extinguished, watching the outlines of soldiers pass in the dim light. Their shadows stretched long and distorted across the walls of houses, as if the war itself was creeping inside. Fear became a second heartbeat. People learned to carry it without speaking of it. Children were hushed when they laughed too loudly. Old men held their tongues when they wanted to curse the uniforms they had once fought against in earlier wars. Women like Anna lived in careful balance, managing households alone, waiting for absent husbands, and pretending strength they did not feel. Yet beneath that silence, there was always a current of defiance, though it was too dangerous to show. A loaf of bread saved for a neighbor, a whispered prayer in church when soldiers were not listening, a song hummed under the breath, too soft to be called rebellion, yet too stubborn to be silenced. Anna carried that quiet resistance to each time she lit the small oil lamp on her table, each time she reread her husband's last letter. She told herself she was enduring, that she would wait for him, no matter how long the occupation lasted. But even she felt the slow erosion of hope. Each passing day under the gaze of the enemy made the absence of her husband sharper, the weight of loneliness heavier. And still, in the midst of this constant surveillance, there was that one soldier. His eyes followed her differently than the others. Not cruel, not mocking, not hungry for control, but curious, hesitant, almost human. Anna tried to dismiss it, to tell herself it was nothing. Yet as she moved through her days under the watchful silence of occupation, she could not ignore the strange, unsettling fact that among the countless men who patrolled her world, one seemed to see her not just as a villager, not just as an enemy's wife, but as a woman. It was a thought she dared not hold on to, and yet it stayed with her, quietly, as persistent as the footsteps of soldiers in the streets. It was at the well where Anna first noticed the difference. The morning was cool, the sky gray with the promise of rain, and women gathered with their wooden buckets, their voices hushed as always. Soldiers lingered nearby, their boots planted firmly in the mud, rifles resting lazily against their shoulders. Most of them watched with the same flat indifference, their expressions neither friendly nor hostile, merely detached, as though the villagers were shadows moving through a world not their own. But one pair of eyes lingered, Anna had bent to lower her bucket into the water, her hands tightening on the rope, when she felt it, not the chill of the well's damp air, but the quiet weight of someone watching. She glanced up briefly, cautious, and saw him standing a little apart from the others. His posture was the same as his comrades, but his gaze was not. There was no smirk, no sneer, no predatory sharpness. Instead, his eyes held a strange softness, a hesitation that unsettled her more than cruelty would have. She looked away quickly. To hold his gaze too long was dangerous, but as she straightened with her filled bucket, she felt the heat of that glance still on her. The thought followed her all the way home, no matter how often she told herself it meant nothing. Days passed, and still she noticed him. He was young, perhaps not much older than her husband, though the war had hardened his face in ways youth should not have allowed. His uniform was the same drab color as the others, but on him it seemed less like a badge of authority and more like a burden he carried. His movements were slower, less eager, as though each step he took was weighed with reluctance. Anna tried to push him from her mind. She had no reason, no right to notice such things. She reminded herself that she was the wife of a soldier fighting far away, that her loyalty was a quiet flame she must guard fiercely, and yet, each time she crossed the square, or passed the patrols in the street, her eyes betrayed her. They found him before she could stop them, and when they met his, even for the briefest second, she felt a strange jolt of recognition. It was not affection, not yet. It was something smaller, subtler, an acknowledgement that in a world where every gaze was cold, his was not. There was danger in that difference. One evening, as she hung laundry in the fading light, Anna caught sight of him again. The patrol passed down the lane, their boots striking the stones with mechanical rhythm. She kept her head lowered, pretending to fuss with the sheet in her hands. But as they walked by, she felt his eyes find her. They lingered, just a heartbeat longer than they should have. He turned his head slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if to assure her that it was not by accident. Her hand stilled on the laundry line, her breath caught, though she forced herself to move again, pinning the cloth with careful precision. When she dared to glance back toward the street, the patrol had already gone, their shadows stretching long against the evening light. Anna's heart beat faster than it should have for something so small. She told herself it was fear, and perhaps part of it was, but beneath the fear was another feeling, more dangerous, a quiet recognition that she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. The loneliness of her empty house seemed sharper after that. The bed felt colder, the silence weighed heavier. She sat at the table with her husband's letter before her, tracing the ink with her fingertips, whispering his words aloud, as though speaking them could bring him closer. But no reply came. The house remained still, and in that stillness, her thoughts returned again and again to the soldier with the eyes that lingered. She imagined what it would mean if others noticed. Neighbors, already watchful and suspicious, might whisper behind closed doors. Another soldier might see the way his gaze lingered and report it. The commander might summon her for questioning, her loyalty tested under the weight of suspicion. Even the smallest sign, a glance, a pause, a breath too deep, could unravel the fragile mask of normalcy she wore each day. Yet despite all this, she could not deny the truth. In a world where every kindness had been stripped away, where war had reduced life to survival and silence, even the gentlest recognition felt like forbidden fire. Anna lay awake that night, listening to the sound of boots echoing faintly through the streets. She tried to banish his face from her thoughts, but it lingered, soft around the edges, unbidden and persistent. She turned onto her side, pressing her husband's letter to her chest, and whispered his name like a prayer. Still, when she finally drifted into uneasy sleep, it was not her husband's face she saw. It was the soldier's eyes, steady, uncertain, impossibly gentle. The well had always been the center of the village. Long before the war, it had been the place of chatter and laughter, where women gathered not just for water but for gossip, songs, and news. Children had once dangled their feet from the stone edge, daring each other to lean too far over the darkness. But under occupation, the well had become a place of quiet ritual. Women came one at a time if they could, or else stood stiffly side by side, their eyes down, their words brief. Soldiers often lingered there, their rifles slung casually, reminding everyone that even water was no longer free. Anna timed her visits carefully, early enough that the air was still cool, late enough that the patrols had passed by on their first circuit. That morning, the streets were nearly empty, only a few distant figures moving between shuttered houses. She carried her bucket with a careful balance, her eyes fixed on the path, her breath steady. But when she reached the well, he was already there. The soldier stood leaning against the stone wall, his cap pulled low. his posture relaxed in a way that seemed out of place among the stiff-backed patrols. He looked up as she approached, and in that moment Anna's heart stuttered. She had thought herself prepared to keep her gaze lowered, her movements steady, her silence intact. Yet his eyes found hers with the same unsettling gentleness she had tried so hard to ignore. For a moment she considered turning back, inventing some excuse, pretending she had forgotten something at home, but the weight of the empty bucket in her hand reminded her she could not. She needed the water, and so she walked forward, forcing herself into the calm rhythm she had practiced so often. She lowered the bucket into the well, listening to the rope creak as it descended. The soldier did not move. She tried to keep her eyes on her hands, on the water rippling below, but she felt his presence close by, steady and unthreatening. When she drew the bucket back up, heavy with water, he stepped forward. Without a word, he reached out and took the handle from her, lifting it with one hand as though it weighed nothing. Anna froze, unsure whether to protest. To accept help from him was dangerous. To refuse might be worse. Her mouth opened, but no words came. He set the bucket down carefully at her feet, then straightened. His expression was unreadable at first, but his eyes softened as they met hers, and then, to her surprise, he spoke. The words were foreign, shaped by the sharp consonants of his language. She did not understand them, not fully, but the tone was unmistakable, gentle, questioning, almost polite. He had said something like, "Too heavy." Anna shook her head quickly, clutching the handle of the bucket as if to remind herself of its weight. "No," she murmured, though he could not understand her. Still, the meaning seemed clear enough. For a heartbeat, they stood in silence. The village square around them was still empty, the shutters closed, the streets quiet. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath. Then, with the faintest hint of a smile, not bold, not mocking, but hesitant, he gave a small nod and stepped back. Anna lifted the bucket, her arms straining against its weight, and began the walk home. She did not look back. She did not dare, but she felt his eyes on her until she turned the corner and the well was out of sight. That night, she thought of the encounter over and over. It had been nothing, she told herself. A simple act, a moment of civility, nothing more. Yet the danger of it clung to her. In a world where kindness had been stripped away, even a single helpful gesture carried the weight of forbidden meaning. She remembered the way his voice had sounded, foreign yet softened by something unspoken. She replayed the brief flicker of expression in his eyes. And, most of all, she remembered the silence that had stretched between them, heavy with things neither dared to say. As she lay awake in her cold bed, Anna tried to remind herself of the man she had promised her heart to, the soldier far away on the front lines. But in the quiet, unbidden, another image returned again and again. The enemy soldier at the well, lowering his voice, offering help with a gentleness that should not have existed in a place like this. And though she pressed her eyes shut and whispered her husband's name into the darkness, she knew that something had shifted. The boundaries she had built so carefully were no longer unbroken. The first words had been exchanged, and with them, the first step across a dangerous line. The days that followed the meeting at the well were heavier than before. Anna tried to lose herself in the rhythms of her work, sweeping the hearth, kneading coarse bread dough, hanging laundry in the yard. Yet even in the smallest tasks, her thoughts returned to him. The soldier's voice, low and foreign, echoed faintly in her memory, as though he had spoken not only to her ears, but to something hidden deep inside her. At first, she told herself it was nothing. War had made her fragile, that was all. Loneliness distorted every detail, made small moments seem larger than they truly were. If she had been surrounded by friends, by laughter, by her husband's steady presence, the encounter would have dissolved into forgetfulness. But the silence of her days left her no such escape. She debated endlessly with herself. At the table, tracing the grain of the wood with restless fingers. At the well, lowering her bucket while listening for the echo of boots. At night, staring at the ceiling while the curfew silence pressed against her window. Ignore him, that was the first command she gave herself. Pretend it never happened. Do not glance at him when he passes. Do not allow her thoughts to wander. She had survived this long under occupation by keeping her head lowered. Why should she falter now? To acknowledge him, even in the privacy of her own thoughts, was already a betrayal of her husband, of her neighbors, of the invisible thread of loyalty that held the village together in its quiet resistance. And yet, there was another voice, softer, more dangerous. He sees you. It whispered in her mind whenever she remembered his eyes. Not the harsh gaze of the commander, not the mocking smirks of other soldiers, but something gentler. In those fleeting moments at the well, she had not been invisible. She had not been just another nameless villager moving silently through the shadow of war. She had been Anna, a woman. She hated herself for the thought. She whispered prayers at night, asking forgiveness for even entertaining it. She pressed her husband's last letter to her lips, trying to draw strength from the faded ink. Yet the more she tried to smother the memory, the more it lingered, like a coal glowing quietly in the ashes. Risk, she knew, lay in every direction. To ignore him might have been safest, but it was not without its own dangers. If she looked away too sharply, if she made her refusal too visible, what if he took offense? What if rejection carried consequences? The enemy had power over everything, over food, over safety, over the fragile thread of life in the village. To draw the wrong kind of attention could unravel what little security she had, but to acknowledge him, even slightly, carried dangers far greater. If her neighbors noticed, whispers would spread. If the commander learned of it, punishment would be swift, merciless, and even if no one saw, there remained the unshakable truth. She would be betraying the man who had kissed her hand on the morning he marched away, promising to return. The debate consumed her. One moment she convinced herself that the soldier meant nothing, that she could bury the memory and continue as before. The next, she felt the pull of curiosity, the quiet ache of longing that she dared not name. She wondered about him in stolen moments. What was his name? Did he have a wife waiting far away? As she waited for her husband, did he feel the same weariness she saw in his eyes? The same hunger for something human in a world that had stripped them both of humanity? The village itself seemed to conspire in her turmoil. Each time she went to the well, she found herself glancing down the street, half expecting to see him. Each time the patrols passed her window, she listened for a slower step, a softer presence. Even the silence of the nights seemed to hum with the question she could not answer. Should she hold to the life she had known, or step carefully, dangerously, into the unknown? Anna carried her bucket home one morning and paused in her doorway. The weight of the water dug into her palms, but heavier still was the weight of decision. She could close the door on this, shut her heart against the soldier's gaze, bury her thoughts beneath loyalty and duty, or she could leave the door just slightly open, a crack wide enough for something forbidden to slip through. She stood there, caught between fear and longing, her breath unsteady, and though she told herself she would choose silence, she knew the truth even then. The decision had already begun to make itself, because in a world stripped bare by war, even the smallest spark was hard to ignore. The morning came grey and heavy, a sky swollen with clouds that pressed low over the village. Anna moved quietly through her small kitchen, her fingers trailing along the table where a few crumbs remained from yesterday's meager meal. Hunger was not new. It had become a quiet companion in every household. Children whimpered at night, stomachs hollow, while mothers scraped pots clean in the hope of finding one last bite. The ration line stretched long, and what was offered rarely satisfied. Anna's strength came not from abundance but from habit, the simple rhythm of boiling water, of kneading flour that never seemed enough, of keeping her mind busy, so it did not wander to her husband on the distant front. She could picture him clearly, his worn boots, the way his hands had always smelled faintly of earth after the fields. But as weeks passed, his image sometimes blurred, as though the absence itself was trying to erase him. It was on one such weary morning that she stepped out toward the square. Her shawl, patched and thin, was drawn tightly across her shoulders, but the cold seemed to seep through regardless. Soldiers were already posted near the well and the food station, their presence a reminder that nothing in the village truly belonged to its people anymore. Anna's eyes met his again. The foreign soldier, the one who had looked at her differently than the others. His gaze was not sharp with suspicion, nor heavy with cruelty, but cautious, almost human. She lowered her head quickly, as though even the act of meeting his eyes was dangerous. And yet, in that small gesture, something unspoken stirred. Later that afternoon, when she returned from the ration line with barely enough for herself, let alone for the small neighbor's child she sometimes fed, she found herself retracing her steps past the patrols near the square. Her heart thudded with unease. She should not have lingered, but he was there, standing back from the others, rifle slung at his shoulder, eyes steady but not hostile. In the faintest movement, so small that it might have been missed if she had not been watching, he shifted a piece of cloth at his side. From beneath it, his hand emerged, holding something dark, wrapped, small enough to conceal but large enough to matter. Bread. Anna froze where she stood, her breath caught in her throat. Bread was life. Bread was warmth, survival, the difference between exhaustion and one more day of strength. But bread from him was also danger. Accepting it could mark her in the eyes of her neighbors. Worse, it could betray the memory of her absent husband. He did not step closer, nor did he speak. He only extended his hand slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. For a moment that stretched long and silent, Anna felt as though the world itself was holding its breath. The sounds of the village seemed to fade, the shuffle of feet, the distant coughs, even the murmur of soldiers' voices. All that remained was the soldier, the bread, and her choice. Her hand trembled as she reached forward, swift but hesitant. She let her fingers brush the coarse crust, pulling it into the folds of her shawl before anyone could notice. Their eyes met only once more, his expression unreadable, hers clouded with both gratitude and fear. No words passed between them, but something more dangerous than words had been exchanged. When she returned to her cottage, she closed the door behind her and pressed her back against it, heart racing. She unwrapped the cloth and stared at the loaf. It was not much, a rough hunk, unevenly cut, but to her it looked almost unreal. She tore a piece away and chewed slowly, feeling life return with every bite. For the first time in many weeks, she felt not just fed, but cared for, though she knew she should not think of it that way. The gift had been simple, just bread, yet Anna knew it was more than food. It was the first step across a boundary that had held fast until now. An enemy soldier had given her sustenance, not through command, not through force, but through choice. And by taking it, she had accepted something she could not yet name, a thread that might unravel everything if pulled too far. That night, when the lamps were dimmed and the village lay in restless sleep, Anna sat awake with the last crumbs still on her table. She thought of her husband, far away, and guilt pressed hard against her heart. But then she thought of the soldier's eyes, not cruel but steady, and the warmth of bread on her tongue. She told herself it was survival, nothing more. Yet in the quiet dark, her heart whispered a truth she dared not admit. Something forbidden had begun. The village was a place where silence had its own weight. Every word spoken seemed to drift farther than it should, carried by ears that were always listening. In such a fragile world, secrets had no soil in which to hide. They grew wild, sprouting through cracks in whispers and sideways glances. Anna began to notice it first at the well. The women, once friendly enough in their guarded way, would lower their voices when she approached. They would continue their talk, but the air around them cooled, and she felt as though she were walking through a curtain of suspicion. She could not tell if they knew, or only guessed, but the truth hardly mattered. In a village bound by fear and hunger, even the suggestion of disloyalty was a shadow that clung too tightly to escape. The soldier, his name she still dared not speak, not even to herself, lingered nearby more often now. He did not intrude, but his presence was felt like a candle burning in the corner of a dark room. The others noticed it too. Farmers, returning from the fields, would glance at him, then at Anna, their eyes hard with the quiet judgment of those who could not afford betrayal in their midst. And so the whispers grew. Some said she was foolish, others said she was dangerous. None spoke directly to her, but Anna carried their thoughts as surely as she carried the pail of water from the well, heavy and spilling with every step. Yet still, she could not deny the pull. The war howled at the edges of her life, but here, in the strange quiet between her and the soldier, there was a different kind of noise, softer, yet no less dangerous. A whisper of its own, like the wind through the broken rafters of a ruined house. She told herself she could stop. She told herself that nothing had truly happened yet, that it was only glances, only kindness. But the village had already decided that something lingered in the space between them, and once the whisper of war begins, it rarely fades. At first, Anna still believed in the letters. The war had taken her husband far away, but surely his words would find their path home. She kept a place for them on the shelf, beside the chipped cup and the folded kerchief he had left behind. Each day she would pause by the door, watching the road, half expecting a messenger to appear with a bundle of worn envelopes tucked beneath his arm. But the road remained empty. The weeks stretched into months, and the only things that arrived were rumors of battles lost, of regiments broken, of soldiers swallowed whole by snow or mud. In the stillness of night, Anna would sit at the table with a stub of candle, staring at the blank wood as if words might write themselves there in his hand. But nothing came. The silence became its own answer. Perhaps he could not write. Perhaps he was too far away, or perhaps he no longer lived to send her words at all. The thought pressed against her chest like an invisible weight, until even breathing felt heavy. It was in this emptiness that the soldier's presence grew larger. His glance, his quiet offerings, his attempts at gentleness, things she had once dismissed as intrusions, began to feel like fragments of the letters she would never hold. She despised herself for it, yet could not escape the truth. Grief had left a hollow space within her, and the hollow does not stay empty for long. The letters never arrived. The silence deepened, And in that silence Anna felt herself slipping, drawn towards something she could neither name nor resist. It began with glances, then with fragments of words, and then with something riskier, stolen moments. The village, though small, was full of eyes. Every street, every doorway, every passing figure carried the danger of discovery. But still, Anna and the soldier found places where silence could soften into speech. The first time was in the barn at the edge of the fields. The soldier lingered as she gathered kindling, his shadow stretching long against the wall of stacked hay. He spoke in halting words, a mixture of his tongue and hers, relying more on tone than meaning. She understood only pieces, but somehow the fragments were enough. A word for home, a gesture for family, a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his own absence, his own longing. Later it was in the fields at dusk, when the sky burned orange before fading into grey. He walked a few paces behind her, careful to appear as though chance had drawn them to the same path. They spoke softly, as though their words were made of glass. She told him of her son, too young to understand why his father was gone. He listened with an attentiveness that unsettled her, his eyes fixed not on the ground, but on her face, as though memorizing every line. Their conversations were not long, never more than a few minutes stolen from the world, but they were fragile and dangerous, and perhaps because of that, they felt more vivid than anything else in Anna's days. The rest of her life had become muted, grey walls, grey streets, grey silences, but in those moments, even the smallest exchange carried color, a word of comfort, a shared laugh at the clumsy attempt to bridge their languages, a pause, long enough to feel the weight of what was unspoken. They were careful, always. If footsteps approached, the words dissolved into silence. If neighbors passed by, she turned away as though he were no more than another soldier standing watch. Yet the secrecy only deepened the bond, as though every risk woven into their words tied them closer together. Anna told herself it was harmless. That conversation was not betrayal, and yet, beneath every word lingered the awareness that they were building something that could not remain hidden forever. Each stolen moment was a seed, small, quiet, fragile, but seeds, once planted, do not remain still. It was never meant to happen, or perhaps, from the first glance, it was always inevitable. What began as a look across a market square, then grew into words, traded in whispers, and half-understood phrases, had now begun to spill over into something neither of them could contain. The barn smelled of hay and damp earth that night. The wind pushed through the loose boards, carrying with it the distant sound of boots on cobblestones, the occasional bark of a dog. Anna was there to collect firewood, or at least that was the reason she gave herself. He was there under the same kind of excuse, lingering longer than his duty required, pretending to check supplies. Both of them knew, though, that it was not wood nor inventory that kept them returning to the same places at the same times. Their conversation was brief, strained by the closeness of their voices and the risk that one misplaced sound might betray them. He asked about her son again, his words fumbling, broken, yet carrying a tenderness that reached her more clearly than language ever could. She answered softly, her hands busy, trying to make the act of stacking sticks look purposeful, though her pulse betrayed her calm. And then it happened. Not sudden, not bold, but something quieter, subtler, far more dangerous. As she passed a bundle of kindling from her arms to his fingers brushed against hers. Not by accident, not entirely. The moment lingered longer than necessary, his hand steady against hers not pulling away as quickly as it should have. The contact was fleeting, a mere breath in the vast silence of the barn, but it carried with it a weight neither of them could deny. It was not just touch, it was acknowledgement, a line crossed, a secret that was no longer bound to words or glances, but now existed in the very space between their hands. Anna drew back quickly, her breath caught in her throat. For a heartbeat, she feared the walls themselves might cry out, that someone outside might have seen, might have known, but there was no witness, no sound but the restless sigh of the wind. He said nothing, only lowered his gaze as though to hide the intensity that had passed between them. All through that night, Anna's hands remembered, as she stirred the pot over the fire, as she tucked her son into bed. Even as she lay awake listening to the distant thunder of artillery, the ghost of that touch remained. It was at once terrifying and intoxicating, a reminder of the boundary she had crossed and could never uncross, and for him, though she could not know it, the memory lingered as well. His duty was to the uniform he wore, to the war that pressed endlessly forward. But for a moment, in that barn, his duty had faltered. His hand had spoken what words could not. The secret between them had changed shape, It was no longer only in their eyes, or in stolen words spoken in half-light. Now, it lived in touch, and with it came a far greater risk than either of them had yet dared to imagine. That night Anna could not sleep. She lay beneath the coarse wool blanket, her son's soft breathing steady beside her, but her own chest felt restless, as though a storm churned inside. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt it again, the faint warmth of another man's hand against hers. A touch so small, so fleeting, and yet it had unsettled everything she thought she knew about herself. Her husband was far away, perhaps alive, perhaps not. She had not heard from him in months, not since the letter that came before the spring harvest. His handwriting had been hurried, the ink smudged, but she had clutched it as if it were gold. "Do not worry, Anna. I am strong. I will come back to you." Those words had carried her through countless cold mornings and empty nights. They had been her anchor, the reason she pushed forward each day. And yet, she had let another man into the quiet places of her heart, not with promises or declarations, but with looks, with words she pretended not to understand, and now, with touch. She had not betrayed her husband in the flesh, not yet, but in her heart, in her silence, in the way she did not pull back quickly enough. She felt she already had. The guilt pressed on her like the weight of stone. Each task the next day seemed heavier. Drawing water from the well, scrubbing the soot from the cooking pot, braiding her son's hair before school. She moved through her routines, but her thoughts whispered in the background, accusing her. What would he think, if he knew? What kind of wife allows herself this weakness? Yet guilt was never simple, for beneath it was another voice, quieter, almost shameful to admit even to herself. The voice that reminded her she was human, that she was tired of loneliness, that the war had taken so much already, that the brief comfort she found in that forbidden touch did not erase her loyalty, but rather filled the void her absent husband had left behind. When she went to bed the following night, she whispered a prayer, though she was not sure who she prayed to anymore. She asked for forgiveness, for clarity, for strength to resist what she feared might come. But beneath the prayer, her body still remembered the warmth of his hand, and her heart, despite all her guilt, longed for more. This was the torment of the war, she realized. Not only the hunger, the fear, the endless waiting, but the quiet battles fought within oneself. No one could see the guilt she carried. No one would ever know the war she waged in silence, alone in the dark, torn between duty and desire. The guilt within her was not loud. It did not scream. It whispered, it lingered, and it grew heavier with each passing day. The village was a place where silence carried further than words. Walls were thin, doors left open, and eyes always seemed to follow. In a community so small, everyone noticed everything, and whispers often held more weight than truth. It began innocently enough. A neighbor woman, older and sharp-eyed, pausing too long at the well. She saw Anna speaking to him again, saw the way their words lingered after everyone else had gone home. She saw, too, the quick turn of Anna's head when she realized she was being watched. That was enough. In times like these, suspicion did not need proof. It needed only a glance, a moment that seemed out of place. The neighbor did not accuse outright. She carried the knowledge like a seed in her pocket, turning it over in her mind, deciding what to do. Soon enough, the seed found soil in the ears of others, in hushed conversations while kneading bread, in quiet remarks made as laundry was hung to dry. "Have you noticed?" they asked. "She lingers too long when he is near. She does not pull away quickly enough. And what of her husband, gone so long?" The villagers, bound by fear and survival, did not shout their suspicions. But rumor is a quiet fire, burning slowly, creeping through the dark until the glow cannot be ignored. It was not long before the whispers reached the wrong ears. The enemy commander was a man who understood that power was often built on secrets. A stolen sack of grain, an extra loaf of bread hidden in a basket, or the suggestion of disloyalty. All of it could be twisted into control. And when he heard the murmurs about Anna, he smiled without warmth. A woman divided between loyalty and weakness was a useful thing. Anna did not know, not yet. She only felt the shift in the air. Neighbors no longer met her eyes in the same way, their voices lowering when she approached. She felt the weight of being watched, though she could not see from where. She carried her guilt in silence, but now she carried something else. The creeping dread that her secret was no longer hers alone. Nightfall came softly, like a heavy curtain being drawn across the sky. The village grew quiet, windows shuttered, doors latched, and only the faint glow of lanterns flickered through the cracks. Anna waited in her small room, her hands trembling as she pretended to mend an old piece of cloth. She listened for the footsteps of neighbors, for the distant sounds of boots on the road, for any sign that she was being watched. When the silence settled deep enough to give her courage, she slipped outside. The air was sharp, laced with the smell of damp earth and smoke from dying fires. Each step toward the woods seemed louder than it should have been, crunching on the frost-touched ground. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little to shield her from the cold or from the fear pressing in on her ribs. He was already there, waiting where the trees grew thick and shadows overlapped. The soldier stood with his back to a rough-barked oak, his figure half hidden, as though the forest itself tried to keep him secret. When Anna saw him, the air left her chest in a rush. For a moment, neither spoke. It was enough simply to see the other, alive, here, in a world that had become so uncertain. When he reached for her hand, she let him, though her heart thundered with the weight of it. His palm was rough, the skin hardened by endless drills and nights without rest. Hers was small and cold, trembling as though she feared even her own choice. They stood close, the space between them charged with all the words they dared not speak in daylight. The wood seemed alive with listening. An owl shifted on its branch, the leaves rustled, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked from the village. Every sound reminded them of the risk, yet neither could pull away. In the dark, they allowed themselves a freedom that daylight forbade. Their whispers carried no great declarations, no grand promises. They spoke instead of simple things, of hunger, of sleepless nights, of memories of home. In those fragments of conversation, they found something precious, reminders that they were still human, not only pieces of a war, but every stolen word deepened the danger. They both knew it, and still they lingered. When Anna finally turned back toward the village, the soldier let his hand slip from hers, slowly, as if releasing her was the hardest act of all. The path home was darker than when she came, and heavier too. She knew these meetings could not continue without cost. Yet, even as she stepped back into the safety of her cottage, Anna carried the warmth of his hand with her, a secret ember burning quietly against the chill of everything else. The next night he came again. This time there was no playful hesitation, no gentle words to soften the danger of their meeting. He looked different, more shadow than man, his face drawn in the moonlight, his eyes carrying a weight that seemed too heavy for anyone so young to bear. Anna felt it before he spoke, that something in him had shifted. She stood still as he approached, his boots leaving deep prints in the soft earth of the forest floor. The air around them seemed thick, as though the trees themselves leaned in to listen. "I cannot do this anymore," he said at last, his voice low, almost breaking. "Not the way they want me to. Not the way this war demands." Anna's breath caught. She wanted to reach for him, but she held back, sensing he needed the words to flow first, unbroken. He turned his gaze upward, past the branches, to the slice of moon above. "Every day I wake up in a uniform that feels like a shroud. I march beside men who laugh at cruelty, who speak of villages as though they are nothing but maps to be burned and taken. And he stopped, pressing a hand to his chest as though steadying himself against something sharp. "I can't keep pretending I am one of them." The silence stretched, filled only by the wind moving through the trees. Finally, he looked at her, his eyes raw, unguarded. "Do you know why I come here? Why I risk everything to stand in the shadows with you?" Anna shook her head slightly, though her heart already whispered the answer. "Because you remind me I am not only a soldier," he said, the words spilling out now, ragged and fierce. "You remind me I am still human. Without you I fear I would forget what it means to feel anything but hatred and fear." He stepped closer, his voice lowering, trembling. "I despise this war. I despise the orders, the blind obedience, the endless march of death. Every scream, every fire, every life taken, it carves at me, piece by piece. And when I look at you, Anna, it stops. Just for a moment, it stops." His hand found hers again, gripping tightly, as though letting go would mean falling back into an abyss. "I should walk away. I should never have spoken to you that first night. But I can't. I cannot let you go, even if it ruins me." Anna felt his desperation as keenly as her own heartbeat. His confession was not only love, it was survival, a desperate tether to a part of himself that war had not yet destroyed. She knew then that what tied them together was no longer chance, but necessity. The forest seemed to breathe with them, dark and watchful. And though fear curled inside her chest, Anna also felt something else stir, a fragile, dangerous hope. The nights had grown heavier since his confession. Every word he had spoken lingered in Anna's chest like an ember, both warming her and threatening to burn her alive. She carried his despair with her, and with it, the fragile secret of their meetings. But secrets have a way of rippling outward, no matter how tightly they are held. It began with questions, a neighbor's lingering glance, a cousin's offhand remark about Anna disappearing after dark, and then, worse still, the murmurs of soldiers passing too close to the edge of the village. Anna felt her ties watching when she stepped outside, ears pricking at her every excuse. The web was tightening. One evening, as she drew water from the well, 2 village women stood nearby, whispering in tones sharp enough to cut. "She's been acting strange," one said, "going out at night, coming back pale, as if she's seen a ghost." The other gave a knowing hum. "A girl like her, she's hiding something. It'll come out soon enough." Anna lowered the bucket slowly, her hands trembling against the rope. She kept her face still, practiced, but inside she could feel the noose of suspicion coiling. That night, when she slipped away to meet him, the soldier's first words only deepened her unease. "They're watching me too," he murmured, his voice taut as wire. "The others. They've begun to notice when I vanish. If they discover where I go, if they discover you," his words broke off, unfinished, as though the thought itself was unbearable. Anna's heart pounded. She wanted to tell him everything, the whispers, the watchful eyes, the danger pressing closer each day, but the moment hovered between them, thick with consequences. If she spoke the truth, she risked breaking what fragile peace they had found. Worse, she risked giving voice to fears that could destroy them both. If she stayed silent, she carried the weight alone, but at least their secret would remain hidden, if only for a little longer. Her throat ached with the choice. Words swelled inside her, ready to spill, but when she looked into his eyes, dark, desperate, clinging to her as if she were the last remnant of his humanity, her voice faltered. Silence pressed down like a second skin. She lowered her gaze, closing her hands around his. "Then we must be careful," she whispered, the only words she dared to give. The rest, the truth of what she knew, the danger coiling closer, remained, locked behind her lips. In that moment, Anna chose silence, not because it was easier, but because it was the only way to keep the fragile thread between them from snapping. Yet even as the choice left her mouth, she wondered if silence itself was a betrayal, that in trying to protect him, she might have doomed them both. The forest seemed colder that night, the stars distant, the air heavy with things unsaid. And somewhere, in the shifting shadows beyond their sight, suspicion stirred, patient and waiting. The days had grown colder. Autumn was slipping into early winter, and with it came a heaviness that hung over the village like an old woolen cloak. Anna moved through her routines almost mechanically now, fetching water, tending to her small patch of a garden, and walking to the bakeress in the mornings to see if there was any bread left after the soldiers had taken their share. She had grown used to her secret life, the stolen meetings, the unspoken bond, and the silence that filled the spaces in between. It had become a rhythm, dangerous though it was, and she had convinced herself that the world beyond the village would never intrude upon it. But one morning, as she stood at her door with a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, she noticed a group of villagers gathering near the square. Their voices carried the unmistakable tremor of news, sharp and hurried. She did not want to join them, too many whispers about her already, too many eyes that lingered too long, but curiosity tugged at her. She walked carefully, her shoes scraping the frost on the ground, and listened. A boy had run through from a nearby town, bringing word. Several regiments had been withdrawn from the front. Prisoners of war were being exchanged, and some soldiers who had long been thought dead were on their way back home. Anna felt her breath catch before the words even finished leaving the man's mouth. A returning regiment. Survivors, could it be? Her mind leaped instantly to her husband. For so long, his letters had stopped arriving, and she had steeled herself against the truth that he might already lie beneath the mud of some faraway battlefield. She had grieved in silence, clung to denial, and then, in her emptiness, turned toward the forbidden comfort of another man. Now, hearing that some soldiers might yet walk through the village gates, she felt as if her entire world had been pulled out from under her. That evening, she sat by the dim light of a single candle, her hands trembling as she sewed a torn sleeve. The soldier, her soldier, though not truly hers, came quietly to the door. He tapped softly, the signal they had come to know, and she let him in. His presence always brought warmth, but tonight she could not look him fully in the eye. He noticed immediately, his brow furrowing as he studied her face. "What is it?" he whispered, his accent bending the words. Anna hesitated. Then, in a voice barely audible above the wind that rattled the shutters, she told him, "There is word. My husband, he may be alive, he may be coming home." The silence that followed was unbearable. His eyes, usually so steady, shifted away, as though searching the darkened corners of her small cottage for answers. She saw his jaw tighten, saw him press his lips together before speaking. And if he does, he asked finally, the weight of the question sinking between them. Anna could not answer. She thought of the man she had married, the promises they had made under the village church roof. She remembered his smile, his hand holding hers, his voice calling her name before the war had stolen him away. But those memories felt distant, blurred, like faded ink on a letter left too long in the rain. And now here she stood, bound not only to him, but also to the man before her, the enemy who had somehow become her refuge. The soldier's shoulders sagged, his voice quieter now. If he comes back, I will be gone. You know this. They will move us again. Another town, another fight. Anna's heart ached at the truth of it. She wanted to cry, to scream, but the tears refused to come. Instead, she nodded slowly, clutching her shawl tighter. I know, she whispered. The days that followed were restless ones. Every sound of boots on the road made her heart leap. Every murmur among the villagers made her blood run cold. She felt as though she were walking a knife's edge, waiting for her husband's possible return, dreading the moment it might come, and still clinging to the fragile, stolen moments with the man she could never truly have. When she lay in bed at night, the candle snuffed out, she listened to the wind howling through the eaves and thought about the two worlds pulling her apart. One was duty, loyalty, the life she had once promised to another. The other was forbidden, dangerous, but achingly real. She wondered which would claim her in the end. The summons came with no warning. A knock at the door shop, deliberate, not like the hesitant taps of neighbors. Anna's breath caught before she even turned the handle. Standing outside was a soldier, stiff in posture, his hand resting on the strap of his rifle. His words were clipped, his accent heavy. The commander wants to see you. Her stomach tightened as she was escorted through the village. The path she had walked 1,000 times, the road past the well, past the church with its broken steeple, past the shuttered homes, suddenly felt foreign. Villagers watched from behind curtains, their faces pale, their eyes filled with the unspoken dread of what happened when one was called. Inside the commandeered farmhouse, where the enemy commander had set up his office, the air was heavy with tobacco smoke and damp wool. Maps covered the table, pins and lines drawn across them like veins of blood. The commander himself sat behind the desk, his uniform immaculate, his eyes cold and assessing. He did not gesture for her to sit. Anna, he began slowly, her name curling off his tongue with unsettling familiarity. There are whispers, whispers of meetings, whispers of disloyalty. His gaze lingered on her face, searching for the flicker of fear that might betray truth. She forced herself to keep her expression steady, though her pulse thudded painfully at her temples. I don't understand, she answered quietly, her voice flat, careful. She chose her words like stepping stones across a river, too much weight on one, and she would slip. The commander leaned forward. A woman alone is vulnerable. That is natural. But some soldiers, they grow foolish. They forget their duty. Have you seen this foolishness, Anna? Her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She shook her head. I see soldiers. I see villagers. Nothing more. For a moment, the silence was unbearable. He studied her, his eyes narrowing, as if he could peel back the layers of her soul with nothing but suspicion. The walls seemed to close in the crackle of the fireplace. The creak of boots on the floorboards outside, even the faint dripping of water from the roof became loud in her ears. Finally, the commander leaned back, exhaling smoke. I hope that is true, because you must understand small betrayals have consequences, not only for soldiers, but for villagers. His meaning was clear. One person's mistake could bring punishment upon all. When she was dismissed, Anna stepped back into the fading daylight, her legs weak, her heart racing. Villagers still watched from their windows. To them, she was already marked. To herself, she was now balancing on a knife's edge. Her secret love had gone from hidden comfort to a peril that could consume them all. The days after Anna's questioning were darker than any before. The commander's words echoed in her mind like a tolling bell. Small betrayals have consequences, not only for soldiers, but for villagers. Every time she walked to the well or past the bakery, she felt eyes upon her neighbors who whispered when she passed, soldiers who lingered too long, watching. Even the air felt charged, as though the whole village was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. At night, when the world lay wrapped in silence, she met the soldier once more. His face was drawn, his hands restless. The gentleness she had once found in him was now lined with tension. He confessed that he too had been questioned. His loyalty pried it with veiled threats. They know something, he whispered, his voice barely more than breath. If we stay, they will not only destroy us, they will destroy everyone. Anna's chest tightened. The soldier's fear was raw, but it mirrored her own. The knowledge that they had already been seen together, too many stolen moments, too many glances exchanged, meant that time was running out. And in that moment, standing in the dim light of the barn where they had hidden before, they both understood. This fragile world they had built in the cracks of war was about to collapse. The decision came not with calm reason, but with desperation. A reckless choice. A final act before the storm. The soldier spoke of slipping away, of abandoning his post, of vanishing into the forests where partisans whispered of freedom and survival. Anna, trembling, thought of her husband's letters, of her village bound in fear, of her own heart torn between duty and desire. To stay meant to suffocate slowly under suspicion. To go meant risking everything at once. They clung to each other in the darkness, their words stumbling, broken by silence, by fear, by the knowledge that dawn might never come for them as it once had. For the first time, the soldier kissed her not with tenderness, but with urgency, the taste of goodbye lingering even as it began. Outside the village was unraveling. Soldiers grew harsher, rounding up supplies, dragging men into forced labor. Neighbors whispered of an informer. An unease thicker than winter fog seeped through every home, and as Anna walked back through the streets that night, her heart still racing, she knew the moment had come. The fragile balance of silence and survival had shattered. Their reckless choice had been made, and whatever came next, betrayal, escape, or ruin, the village itself would feel the tremor. It came not with a sudden explosion of drama, but with a quiet inevitability, as though the weight of war itself had finally pressed too hard on their fragile bond. The soldier had been ordered away, pulled to the front lines where reinforcements were desperately needed. Rumors spread through the village like smoke, new offensives, heavier patrols, commanders growing restless with suspicion. The air seemed to pulse with urgency, and for Anna and the soldier, there was no more space to hide. Their farewell was not planned. It unfolded in the shadows of the barn, the same place where stolen moments had once felt timeless, where whispers had carried the illusion of safety. But now the barn felt colder, emptier, every sound magnified, as though the walls themselves bore witness. He stood with his uniform half buttoned, as though ready to march even as his body trembled. She could see it in his eyes, that conflict of duty and longing, the knowledge that he was already gone even as he reached for her hand. For a moment neither spoke. Silence hung between them like a blade. When he finally did speak, his words came raw, fragile. If we had met anywhere else, if the world had been different. He stopped himself, the weight of unfinished sentences too heavy to carry. Anna's breath caught in her chest, her own words dissolving before they reached her lips. What was there to say? That she had loved him in stolen fragments. That their time together had been both betrayal and salvation. That she would remember him, even as though it had never been. She leaned into him, resting her forehead against his, and for one suspended moment, it felt as though the war, the suspicions, the dangers all fell away. Just two souls, clinging to something neither could hold. She wanted to tell him to stay, to run, to fight against the inevitable, but she knew. To speak it aloud would be crueler than silence. The kiss they shared was not of passion, but of finality. A quiet sealing of everything they had been, and everything they could never be. No promises, no future. Only the fragile warmth of memory pressed into skin, the taste of salt from unspoken tears. When he pulled back, his hand lingered at her cheek, trembling as though he too feared the world would dissolve without her. Then he turned, the dim lamplight catching the edge of his uniform, and walked into the night. His figure faded with each step, swallowed by shadow until he was gone. Anna stood alone in the barn, her breath shivering in the cold air. Outside, the village remained silent, its streets steeped in suspicion, its houses heavy with secrets. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, as though trying to hold in the fragments of him that still lingered, and whispered a farewell that no one but the night could hear. And just like that, it was over, vanished as though it had never been. The years passed, as years always do. The war ended, leaving behind its ruins, its gravestones, its scars carved deep into both land and memory. The village was rebuilt in fragments. New fences, patched roofs, freshly painted doors. Children grew into adults who knew the sound of peace, though they carried the shadows of what their parents had endured. And Anna, older now, moved quietly among them, her hair streaked with gray, her back slightly bent, her steps measured and slow. No one in the village spoke openly of the occupation anymore. It was safer that way, easier. Those who had survived preferred silence to confession. Memories like weeds had been pushed down into the soil where no sunlight could reach. Yet Anna carried within her a private history, one no rebuilding could erase. At night, When the house grew still and the voices of her children and grandchildren faded into sleep, she would sit by the window, watching the fields stretch toward the horizon, and remember. She remembered the weight of rationed hunger, the endless waiting for letters that never came, the creak of boots on the village road. She remembered the whispers, the suspicious glances, the constant tension of living under watch. But, more than anything, she remembered him, the enemy soldier who had once, against all reason, placed bread into her hands, spoken to her in hushed fragments of words, and touched her as though she were not conquered, not owned, but simply human. It had not lasted. Such things could never last. The war had taken him away as easily as it had brought him, and life had demanded that she move on. She bore her husband's return, his silence about the missing years, his inability to ask what had happened in his absence. Together, they lived a kind of truce, raising children, tending land, fulfilling duty. Yet, in the quiet spaces of her heart, Anna held on to the forbidden memory, the one that could never be spoken aloud. Sometimes, when the wind shifted through the trees at dusk, she imagined she could still hear his voice, soft, halting, foreign. Sometimes she could still feel the warmth of his hand brushing hers in a barn thick with shadows. It was a ghostly presence, not haunting her with regret, but with a bittersweet ache that reminded her of who she had been, of what she had risked, of the strange tenderness born in the ugliest of times. And so, as the years settled into the rhythm of old age, Anna did not tell her story. Not to her children, not to her husband, not even to herself in clear words. It remained unspoken, buried like a relic beneath the surface of her life. But in the stillness of night, when memory rose up unbidden, she would close her eyes and feel it once more, the echo of a love forbidden, fragile and fleeting, yet impossibly alive. For some wounds of war are not scars of pain, but of longing, and those wounds Anna knew do not heal. They only rest, deep within, whispering across the years like a song that can never be sung aloud.